You always kept your arms. You just weren't obliged to be in the militia. You could be there voluntarily, but it was your duty to serve for 160 years before, and arguably today it is your duty to be in the militia. It's not voluntary. It also said, and shall, it says between the age of 18 and 45, and shall be armed, equipped, and trained as the General Assembly may provide by law. You shall be armed, equipped, and trained. It's not voluntary. We must be armed, trained, and equipped. It's consistent with the federal government that wants us disciplined, organized, disciplined, and armed. That's consistent between state and federal law. It goes on in the 1818 Constitution to say that all men born equally free and independent and have certain inherent and indefeasible rights. Indefeasible rights meaning they can't be nullified. And among which are those of enjoying and defending life and liberty. Defending it. And acquiring, possessing, and protecting property and reputation. Defending your life and liberty of your fellow citizens, protecting your property. This is not empty words. This is something we have to do. This is something that the militia is charged with. Nobody else. It says that all power is inherent in the people. That was pretty obvious. That was consistent with the federal government also. Now, on page 2, we move up to the Constitution of Illinois was revisited in 1870. Now there, the militia clause says, consistent with the original, consistent with the federal, says the militia of the state of Illinois shall consist of all able-bodied male persons between the age of 18 and 45. And again, it says the General Assembly, in providing for the organizing, equipment, and discipline of the militia, shall conform as nearly as practicable to the regulations of the government of the armies of the United States. Again, 1870, it's not optional. Now, we'll fast forward to the 1970, they revisited the Constitution of Illinois. Huge mistake. Because by 1970, we were already well running along in socialism, fascism, dabbling in a little communism. So to revisit a constitution of a state is very dangerous, and we won't get into it because it would take a whole day to get into some of the conflicting clauses. But still, right there under the militia, in 1970, the current Constitution of the state of Illinois says the state militia consists of all able-bodied persons residing in a state. It's no longer just males. It's no longer between a certain age, because women have been emancipated, their bras have been burned, they've joined in the workforce, they pay taxes now, they are in the militia too. And it's no longer age restriction, because that would be, you know, politically incorrect. Everybody who's able-bodied. So if you're 90 years old, you're not senile, you got good eyesight, steady hand, you're able-bodied, you are in the Illinois militia. Now, there is a conflicting clause in the 1971. It says in section 22, right to arms, subject only to the police power, the right of the individual citizen to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. There is no such thing as an unarmed militia. The militia is not subject to the police power. That clause cannot be interpreted to disarm the militia in any way. If you look on page 3, you will see what the United States Supreme Court says about interpreting words in the Constitution. At the top, it says the language of the Constitution has to be interpreted in light of the tacit assumptions upon which it is reasonable to suppose that the language was used. That was in 1930, a Supreme Court case. Now in 1887 also, we must place ourselves in the position of men who framed and adopted the Constitution and inquire what they must have understood to be the meaning and scope of its provisions. Again, the militia is all able-bodied persons, armed, disciplined, organized. We are a permanent institution of government. We are not subject to our servant government telling us when we can have firearms, and it can only be for sporting clays or you know, maybe home protection, but nothing too big. We can't have you have too many bullets in your gun. The militia is a permanent institution of government. It stands next to the executive, the Congress, the Supreme Court, the president. We could no more be subjected than they can. And arguably and truthfully, we are the oldest of all the institutions of our government, because none of the other ones existed prior to the Constitution. But the militia existed for 160 years prior to this country being formed. So, what do we do when we come across conflicts? A little further down, about the middle of the page 3, here's the United States Supreme Court again. It says, the Constitution is filled with provisions that grant Congress or the state specific power to legislate in certain areas. These granted powers are always subject to the limitation that they may not be exercised in a way that violates other specific provisions of the Constitution. You cannot say that you have a militia that must be armed, organized, disciplined, and then say, subject to the police power, you have the right to keep and bear arms. So that subject to police power cannot possibly be interpreted to disarm the militia, to unorganize the militia, to unequip the militia, to undiscipline the militia. In Illinois, nowhere in that Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and the federal and the state Constitution is the supreme law in Illinois. Nowhere in there does it say the legislature has any discretion or authority whatsoever to separate the militia into organized or unorganized militia. There is no such authority that we the people ever gave to our Illinois legislature. Our General Assembly in Illinois went on to write statutes, which are below the Constitution, that says the National Guard is hereby the organized militia, and everybody else is unorganized. Go home. You're undisciplined. You're unorganized. Go watch TV. Nowhere in our constitutions did we, the people, grant that legislative body the authority to do that. The only militia, there is only one. It is all able-bodied person. It is not the National Guard. The Constitution, both in Illinois and the Congress, makes distinctions between Army, Navy, troops, and the militia. They are worded separately. There is no such thing as the unorganized militia. So how should we treat the Illinois legislature's statutes that say we're all to be, 99.9% of us are to be unarmed and go home undisciplined and not be in a militia? Well, the United States Supreme Court has dealt with this many times. On page 3,